In this episode, we look at internal controls in the EU. Man is back with our new season where Compliance Man is on a EuroTrip. And in this episode, what practitioners should know about approaches to internal controls in Europe. I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Compliance Man himself, Tim Khasanov-Batirov. And today we have Alex Movchan with us, and we're here to talk about internal controls. Alex, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Great to see you, and hello, team.
Hi, Alex.
So, Alex, for you and our listeners, Compliance Man previously practiced largely in emerging markets. He has now migrated to Europe. So he is going on a journey and telling us and helping us learn about some of the differences in compliance in the EU and Europe from emerging markets and here in the United States. We are having a conversation with our listeners, and it has been a great journey so far, and I'm thrilled to have you join us as our special guest. You're the president of the Institute for Internal Controls in Central Europe and the chief risk officer at a global medical device company. You have tremendous experience with internal controls, international experience. I'm going to suggest that's outside the United States. For internal controls, compliance, risk management, and internal audit. But could you please tell us a little bit about your professional background and what you're doing now, Alex?
Yeah, so basically, I have around 16 years of experience in internal audit, internal controls, and risk management overall, having a bunch of certificates like CIA certified internal auditor, certified fraud examiner, internal controls professional, and so on. And basically, I would say I'm specialized in helping the companies to build all the internal controls and risk management frameworks, which are needed for different purposes. Like, for example, getting ready for the IPO, for the listing, like I did for my previous employer who was listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. Also, I had experience with the New York Stock Exchange, Stockholm, Warsaw, and so on. And also now working for the company which is owned by the private equity fund. So basically providing all the needed support in terms of value enhancement. So building basically all the second and the third lines of defense if we're talking about the IAA 3 lines of the defense model.
Tim, over to you.
Alex, thanks. As Tom has said, we are happy to have you today. And as we know, you are the member of the leadership team of the Institute for Internal Controls. Can you please share with us what are the best practices, what are the most effective ways that the companies now deploy in terms of internal controls?
Yeah, so basically, I would always suggest to start with, let's say, the frameworks, such as the SOX or the COSO. So basically, if we're talking about the COSO, I think I like it the most. I suggest to have a look at the one called strategy, integrating strategy and performance measurement, because basically it shows that, let's say, that the strategic initiatives of the company and the controls, they should be intersected like a DNA. And with this, let's say, approach to risk management, that this is interconnected with the business, I would like to mention, let's say, the setup of the controls, the framework of the controls in the company, starting from the helicopter view and going down into details. So basically, if we start on a high level, these are the entity level controls, which set the tone, such as the code of conduct, some approval matrices, and the other kind of high level guidances. Then when we go deeper, of course, controls regarding to financial statements, so financial reporting controls, like the closing checklist, certain approvals of the financial statements before they are published. Then we go to the process level controls. So here we need to have well-documented end-to-end processes, operational as well as financial. So some controls built in the risk points. And then basically going into IT general controls. So these are the controls set around the overall IT infrastructure. So access controls, for example, then, for example, removing access if somebody is leaving, and all kind of controls that support the overall IT infrastructure. So if we set it up properly from the beginning, this framework, then we're already on a good way, and then implementation, this is the next step.
So, Tim, I'd like to ask you to compare your experience in either emerging or high-risk market outside the U.S., particularly around the differences in attitudes on internal controls. And let me preface it with sort of the following. When I used to talk about internal controls in the United States, you could, one, tell the lawyers because their eyes rolled inside their heads immediately. But two, you could tell the internal control specialist because they understood that internal controls are literally the backbone of every compliance program. Tim, has that been your experience, or is it something completely different in emerging markets or even high-risk markets?
Tom, thanks for pointing out. I think it's a very critical thing. What I have faced both at the emerging markets and the developed markets is the differentiation between lawyers and compliance people or lawyers with internal control focus. So I have faced a lot when really good lawyers might not be very good in compliance because they do not recognize, they do not acknowledge the importance of internal controls. So they are just doing the things that they're used to do for many years. They can do anti-corruption clauses. Now we're talking about sanctions. They can do something like legal work related to that, but they don't understand that what we need is to have the control over the situation, which means that you have to have internal controls in place. It's also only it's also putting controls as such in the transactions, it's risk management, it's communication. It's something that is developed under different approaches and methodologies like COSO, for instance, and all these things. So I agree with you that there are different approaches, and mostly I would define the difference in attitudes between lawyers with the legal views and lawyers who look at compliance as a set of internal controls.
So with that, what do you see around those same challenges in the EU? Is it more sophisticated? That's not the right word. Is it different in the EU? And maybe Alex, you could weigh in too, because my journey was that in 2014, I read the COSO Internal Controls Framework, which was released in 2013. And I literally said, who wrote this? This is great. This is exactly what compliance is. And that's when the light bulb went off of that compliance is essentially internal controls, or internal controls of the backbone. And since that time, I've been a huge advocate. But Tim, maybe we'll start with you from your perspective, because you're the one that's moved to the EU more recently. What do you see? Is there that same sort of recognition, or is it still a learning journey for many?
Tom, thanks for asking this question. And I might be a little bit provocative, saying that being in the EU, I haven't seen that such much appreciation towards internal controls as such. And I'm talking to my colleagues, to peers. We talked with Alex in Warsaw last week when we were at the conference. I'm talking in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands with the professionals. And you know what, Tom? You just mentioned that in 2014 you have read COSO. And if we refer to the many standards that compliance people are using now, are developed considering those standards. And those standards, like frameworks, were developed in many instances, in majority of instances, by the US authorities. So we have the compliance frameworks for anti-corruption compliance based on FCPA requirements, hallmarks of the effective compliance program. We have the same approach with regards to sanctions compliance. So FAC has developed its commitments framework for sanctions compliance. And what I have seen in Europe, that we probably until recent times didn't have a lot with regards to something that will give a lawyers feedback or frame based on internal controls that they will be using in their compliance practice. That's why I here in the EU sometimes see that still there is a gap between legal approach and internal control / compliance approach as it should be.
Alex, let me ask you about your experience with the message of internal controls. Is that something that resonates with sort of non-internal control specialists or non-internal auditors? When you sit down and try to explain to them, do you get the same reaction I did? Their eyes roll back inside their head, or do they see this as a backbone of not simply a compliance program or even financial accounting controls, but something is maybe as broad or as different as ESG?
Well, I would say that it heavily depends on the ownership structure. So basically, what the owners, who are the owners, and what are their priorities. Again, if we are talking about listed companies, here it's clear you have a framework that you need to comply with. And here, basically, the rule is more or less, the more west you go, the more, let's say, requirements the frameworks have, right? So SOX probably would be the best one in terms of putting really detailed requirements, what is needed. There are some other requirements from London Stock Exchange, which is also more going in the SOX direction, but there are other stock exchanges more like it's in Central Europe, which basically have very basic controls requirements. So it depends on the ownership structure and on the geography, and more or less, if you take the Transparency International heat map for the, let's say, corruption risks, I would say that the operational risks would more or less be colored the same. So high level, the more west you go, the more green you are in terms of approach, and the more, let's say, east you go, the more red you are. Like going to the next point, I would say also the second type of owners are the private equity. There, I would say also having good understanding that the processes and the controls, this is the value enhancement for the owners, be it potential listing and the owners being basically public, or another private equity or some bigger multinational that could buy this company. So these two types of owners are more supportive of the controls. When it comes to private owners and family-owned business, this is like a very different owner to owner. The other point which I wanted to raise here is basically the speed of changes. So I would say that changes are happening very rapidly now, all over the world and in Europe as well. And basically, controls is you need to write down the process, you need to define them, you need to implement. So let's say it's a more stable thing and it takes time, and not all businesses react to the business change, the environment change, with the same speed of their, let's say, internal control frameworks update. We saw cases like the Silicon Valley Bank, they had certain approach to risks, but then the market changed and they did not update their risk management approach, and then they went bankrupt. There was also a case with Credit Suisse in Europe. They also had some internal controls topics, and they were acquired by UBS, but this was not, let's say, a voluntary acquisition. They were happy basically to get matched, not to have bigger problems. So all these cases show that we need to adapt faster as internal controls professionals and as business managers. We need to update to the changes faster, because the ones who update faster their internal control frameworks, they will be on the top of the markets. And here, basically, I would like to touch another important matter. It's the ESG matter. And Tim, I know that you were speaking on a panel recently in the First Legal Forum regarding the ESG topics. How do you see overall the ESG, let's say, is it getting the traction globally and in the EU? What are your views?
Alex, thanks for this question. And you know what? I conducted a survey these days at LinkedIn, and I would be glad to share with you the results. So basically, the question was, is ESG on your corporate agenda? So 47% of votes voted for the option yes, and we know what to do. So almost half of our 120 people who participated said, yeah, ESG is in our corporate agenda and we know what to do. And you know what's interesting? 19% said, yes, it's on our corporate agenda, but we don't know what to do. 15% voted for the option no, we don't know what, and no, we don't have ESG on our corporate agenda. And 19% has chosen the choice, what is ESG? So we might make a conclusion that 50% of companies, they start to think about that seriously, while half of the companies just don't know how to start. What we have in Europe, we have some developments in terms of CSRD, which will be the reporting requirements for big corporations very soon, and it will be an ESG-based things. We have some legal developments with regard to EU directives on due diligence of supply chain with regards to kind of new things to compliance. And this is also that we have on our agenda. So I believe that the EU companies started to put attention on this topic. But as Alex, you have mentioned, we talked to the professional community. We don't have experts that in that extent that we need, because there are so many new regulatory requirements in the EU that we have to comply with. So we will need to find out how we can do that effectively. We have very tight deadlines, and we are looking very attentively on all developments where hope that we will be able to match the regulatory expectations, and we put attention of our listeners and viewers in terms of putting more attention to sustainability in ESG, in your role as a compliance person, in your role as a internal control person or internal audit person, or even a lawyer. Tom, what do you think? What are the trends in the States? What do you think about ESG generally?
Well, as you know, there's no uniform or U.S. national law around ESG. We are looking to Europe, the EU, for really leadership on the standards. The Securities and Exchange Commission has floated proposed standards for some time now, and we still don't have a final rule on that. From the business perspective, that's really leading ESG, and the business perspective means that if you want to do business with a company, they have to have an ESG program in place, or you have to have an ESG program in place. So that's driving a lot. In terms of controls, it's still around with the E part, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions is the largest or the one that gets the most probably publicity, but it's obviously much more than that. The I guess, Tim, the thing that I would say about to the U.S. compliance practitioner around internal controls is things outside the United States are different. And particularly as you move across Europe to emerging markets, country managers, regional managers have much more authority outside the United States than they do inside the United States. And so, for instance, a country manager, and you name the country, Kazakhstan, Vietnam, Nigeria, it doesn't matter where, they're going to have significant authority. And they may have more authority than their sort of equal counterparts back in the corporate office in the United States. And so what I suggest is you really need to have controls in place over a country manager. Not saying that they need to be constrained, but a country manager may have up to $1 million in discretionary authority. And if you don't have a control in place, which acts as a second set of eyes over that country manager, you have the possibility that that country manager could use funds that's available to him or her, either illegally or against your corporate compliance program. So the structure of compliance programs and internal controls for U.S. and Western European companies in emerging markets is different by necessity, because you have to be able to make decisions more quickly and more regionally, and don't bring everything back to the home office. But what I think that requires is someone like Alex to sit and help a company understand what internal controls can you put in place over those who have significant discretionary or signing authority, and how can those controls act as I call it, a second set of eyes, so that there's an appropriate level of oversight. So that's really the what I try to emphasize when I talk to U.S. compliance practitioners about internal controls in emerging countries. And I guess, Alex, I would ask maybe your thoughts on that. And can a corporate office, the home office, wherever that may be, in the EU or in the United States, put that second set of eyes over a country manager or over a regional manager in the form of internal controls?
Well, that's a very good question. Thanks a lot, Tom, for asking, because basically this is the first, I would say, the most important point. It's like, do we recognize the need of the controls, and who recognizes it? If the recognition goes from the owner, from the corporate office, and goes down, this is a proper tone from the top. But if there is only recognition in, let's say, controls compliance function, but there is not so much understanding of those topics from the top management, from the CEO, CFO, and all the owners, this will be a different, let's say, environment, right? So basically, definitely there should be a set of controls, and I would say that these controls should be designed in line with, let's say, the decision-making mechanism, the authority delegation mechanism in the company. If the decisions are more, let's say, concentrated in the head office, then you have like more controls there, and they are rolled down through the organization. If you have, let's say, the company culture that the company more delegates to the local country office heads, then the control set should be designed differently. Then basically the control experts should go to the offices and create the tailored internal control frameworks for the offices. Of course, let's say the high-level logic will be aligned, but the details might be different. Let's say the authority levels or certain specifics which is connected, let's say, with the local legislation or things like that. So definitely we need to have a proper set of controls on the country levels. But the approach is, will it be the top-down, or will it be more tailored to the local offices? This relates to the, let's say, company culture and the setup of the specific company, of the decision-making mechanisms. Tim, and what's your opinion about that? What did you see in the emerging markets?
Yeah, I would agree with the point of view that in many corporate cultures, the country managers, the emerging markets, traditionally, historically, have much more power. And this is due to a number of reasons. First of all, legal reason. If you are head of subsidiary in, for example, Kazakhstan, you are liable and accountable for the actions of your company there, which means that you have much more power in terms of everything. Recruiting people, compliance, internal controls, audits, everything, communications with the head office. So I would agree with Tom that, and that what I have seen in practice, that in many countries of so-called emerging part of the world, there are a lot of differences in terms of power that local general managers have. And I agree with you, Alex, in terms of the corporate cultures that might be different. Yeah, specifically in the EU company, depending on sometimes the country of where we have the headquarters, or the corporate culture that historically is there, or sometimes, Tom, what I have faced, I know that Alex has faced as well, there is a very interesting stories when you have one European company acquired by another company from the different perspective and different views on internal control because of, for example, maturity level. So it might be that the company with the more advanced internal control frameworks is acquired by the company which doesn't have such a culture. The maturity level of internal control there is lower, and it's interesting how things are going on in this setting. So that's really interesting. And today I raised the question, the gap, and the thing that I think is a big problem, that sometimes lawyers or compliance people are not very acquainted with internal controls framework, internal control concepts, internal control philosophy. Alex, what will be your recommendations for compliance officers of international corporations in terms of internal controls? What we should know, at what things we should, what we have to pay attention on, what topics with regard to internal controls, how to proceed? What's your view?
Well, first of all, I think they should understand the core frameworks, at least high level, such as COSO and SOX. Second, I would say that they should, let's say, work jointly with the internal controls risk management people. So don't go the silo approach where lawyers, we care only about our setup. But I think all the second line of defense functions like compliance, legal, internal controls, risk management, they should work jointly and, let's say, initiate the projects jointly for the business. Because overall, these functions, they usually are doing a good job. They're hard workers, but maybe they are not so good at, let's say, PR skills, at, let's say, bringing and selling the products of the work to the top management. And I think this is something which is very important, because if we do not have the proper, let's say, emphasis from the top, we will not be able to actually implement the initiatives. And here I would like to say big thanks to Tom for being such a good advocate of the profession and for bringing the world to the organizations globally. So yeah, thanks a lot for that. And maybe I would like to pass the word here to Tom. What is your recommendation for the compliance officers who work in international companies in terms of understanding internal controls from your perspective?
So the first thing to do is also the easiest. If you have if you're in the office, go down the hall and take a pizza to your internal controls department and say, I'd like to visit with you over lunch with pizza in hand, because you as a compliance professional need to understand what internal controls does within the organization. If you do not have the ability to walk down the hall and talk to them, schedule a Zoom call and talk to your internal controls specialist who is not in the United States. Find out what their challenges are, find out what's working and what's not, find out if their controls are being overridden by management on a regular basis so that they essentially make the control ineffective, and find out what you can do in compliance to support controls, internal controls. Because internal controls, as you said several times, Alex, if you're a U.S. company or you touch the United States, you've got a SOX requirement. So you have to have these in place, meaning they're going to exist. And if you as a compliance professional can support your internal controls specialist, it's going to make their job more effective. And that's going to make your compliance program more effective. After you've had that first pizza, though, then you can sit down and start to learn, how can I make my compliance program better by tweaking internal controls? And that comes from learning about internal controls and then sitting down with a specialist like yourself to say, is there a different way to do this? Is less more? Do we need more? How are we overseeing our international operations in emerging or high-risk markets? So I really advocate a dialogue starting with a compliance professional, literally walking down the hall to talk to you or someone like you to try to understand what are controls, and then moving forward to put a better set of controls in place, not more controls, but just a better and more effective set. And if compliance professionals would do that, particularly my lawyer brethren, you would find that your compliance program can be much more effective. I think making your entire business processes more efficient, leading at the end of the day to greater profitability.
Fully agree.
So, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time. I knew we would geek out on internal controls because it's one of my favorite topics. But Alex, before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted any more information on you, or maybe even to connect with you to follow up, how would be the best way for them to do so?
Well, I would appreciate to get connected via LinkedIn and share our thoughts in good professional discussions.
Alex, I wanted to thank you again for all our listeners, myself, Tim, and now Alex. We are all here for you. I hope you will join us for our next episode of the EuroTrip of Compliance Man. If you've said something we disagree with, we'd love to hear from you because we'd love to have a dialogue. So on behalf of Alex and Tim, thank you guys, and I look forward to continuing the EuroTrip of Compliance Man.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Thanks, Tim.
This is Tom Fox again. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Compliance Man Takes a Euro Trip. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. Compliance Man Takes a Euro Trip is this season's offering of Compliance Man, and I hope you're enjoying it, and I hope you'll join Tim and I again for our next episode. Compliance Man Takes a Euro Trip is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.